If you've not yet visited our YouTube channel, point your browser to YouTube and then search for Render Plus Systems. That's our channel. This is a great place to find resources, lots of nice videos from experts with IRender NXT and other Render Plus Systems software, showing great examples, great how-to videos to help you get the most from IRender NXT. I also want to encourage you to visit renderplus.com, where you'll find the latest information on our products. We publish our webinar schedule on our website, and there are lots of tutorials, links to videos, and documentation on using IRender NXT. So a very good resource as you're developing your skills with our software. If you have a trial version of IRender NXT installed on your computer, when you start SketchUp, the first thing that you'll have to do is click Extensions. And when this drop-down menu appears, you'll see IRender NXT Load. Click it, and our interface is going to load. Now, this is a model I'm going to use for a little while. This is a beach cottage. And whenever I open a model in SketchUp, the first thing that I'm really anxious to do is create a rendering. So this will get us started in our discussion on lighting with IRender NXT. When you click Render, this dialog appears. This is the Rendering Settings dialog, and this one is particularly focused on some very important features of the software. Across the top, you'll notice that there is a section titled Lighting Presets. These lighting presets are exactly what is being suggested. They ensure that a lighting style for the rendering that you intend to generate is set up for you automatically. The first one that I want to introduce you to is called Studio High Dynamic Lighting. Here's how it works. Imagine that you take your model to a photographer studio to get professional photographs made to either share with clients or include in a brochure for your firm. The photographer sets up lights around your model, might include filters and gels, and in the end creates a wonderful photograph of your model. Now, if we were to take our beach model to a photographer and have a photograph made using Studio High Dynamic Lighting, here's the rendering that IRender NXT creates. An example that might illustrate a little more clearly what's going on is Studio High Dynamic Lighting, as you can see in this model of a table, uses multiple light sources in order to create this really nice rendering of the table. We emulate studio lighting by using an image that is the sunlight as though filtered through a canopy of trees. The benefit is that the model is sampled with very bright light, with filtered light through that canopy of trees, and then also in shadow. Now, in the object of the table, it's very interesting because this lighting solution gives me a great example of how this table and its material will behave in virtually any lighting condition. Probably an easier concept to understand is the idea of generating an exterior rendering of our model using the sun. This lighting solution uses the SketchUp sun position to cast shadows on our model. IRender Next has rendered a very nice image of the sky behind our model, and then with the sun is casting very nice shadows on our building. You'll also notice that in the windows on our building there are reflections. So in this example, we're getting a very nice reflection of the sky in the glass on our model. Now I'm going to use exactly the same view of our model, and I'm selecting a very unlikely lighting preset, interior, no sun. Now get ready for a big shock, because look how it gets rendered. Essentially, because this model has no artificial lighting, the only lighting that is being used on this model is either from the sun and or from the sky. Now in this case, interior lighting, no sun, the sky and the sun are both turned off. Now I've come right back to the presets dialog, and the only thing I did was click sky to enable the sky. You'll notice immediately that when I do that, the interior no sun is now not selected. And that's because with one little change, just turning on the sky, that does not match interior no sun any longer. However, now when I process the rendering, here's what I get. The only light being used to render this model is the sky. And you'll notice, however, that this model is illuminated on all sides and actually has some very nice shadows being cast. In many ways, much better than just using the sun. The sky is delivering multiple sources of light to this model, and so the shadows are much softer, much more interesting, and this wall, for example, underneath this overhang changes in its brightness from up under the overhang where it's very dark, gets brighter as we move down the wall, and the wall is more exposed to light. So already a much more realistic rendering of this model. The model rendered with just the sky. Now this gets even more interesting, because this time we're going to select HDRi sky, which is also going to be used as a background. If you're not familiar, HDRi means high dynamic range imaging. The HDRi image that I'm using is a sunset image. So the sun is very low in the sky. You can tell that from the reflection in the windows. There's nice clouds in these higher windows, and you can see the horizon with the orange cast to the sky because the sun is going down. And of course, that's also very nicely illustrated on the right side of this rendering. More importantly, what you will notice is that the face of this building exposed to this orange sun while setting is much warmer than in the previous rendering. Now, for those of you who have ever worked for an architect and have grabbed a camera and gone out photographing completed projects, you may remember that typically you'll photograph buildings when the sun is at or lower than 45 degrees above the horizon. And the reason that we photograph buildings in this way is exactly for this purpose. We want nice, warm lighting on our buildings. That can be achieved with IRender Next and selecting an HDRi image that has the sun at 45 degrees or lower to give you these nice warm colors on your building. So what we're looking at is an HDRi image being used as a background and also illuminating the model. And just like using the SketchUp sky, multiple lights are being generated from this HDRi background, so every face of our model is properly illuminated. I wanted to show you the two rendered images side by side. Again, here is our model rendered with just the sky background. That's the standard SketchUp sky rendered nicely by IRender Next. And you'll notice how neutral all of the coloring is. The image is much more convincing and much more appealing when we use an HDRi sky. And in this case, I wanted to choose a sky that matched what I would probably want to do if I had my camera and went out to photograph this building. And so since I happen to have a really nice sky with a good sunset, I selected that as my HDRi image, and I end up with a nice warm-toned rendering of my building. Interestingly enough, you'll find that this HDRi image is available in IRender Next. It's the sunset image. So again, nice warm rendering using HDRi sky and selecting a sunset image for the rendering. Now, HDRi sky background is just using the HDRi sky, and when you select it, the sun is turned off. I turned the sun on by bringing up the presets menu and selecting sun, and just like before, what you will notice is that now HDRi sky is no longer selected. That's only because the sun being turned on does not match the definition of this lighting preset. And I hope what you're catching on to is that these presets are a good start. They establish a lighting solution for your model that is in many cases ideal for the type of rendering that you probably want to create. But at the same time, you can, anytime you want, add other lighting channels to the model and create a rendering. So now let's see the HDRi sky background, but include the sun. What that restores to the model is this really nice shadow and also this nice shadow underneath this eave. Now, whether or not that's what you would do for your model is entirely up to you. I wanted to just point out that the presets are not hard and fast rules. You still have a lot of license as an artist and as a designer to control the quality of the rendering and include things like the sunlight whenever you want, even if the preset doesn't include it automatically. So you have a lot of license on how your rendering is going to be processed. I'm going to pause right here for just a second because I'm hoping that what I've just explained makes a lot of sense to everyone and that you already have maybe gained some confidence in taking control over how the renderings can be processed with IRender Next. Does anybody have any questions about using lighting presets and then maybe being tempted every now and then to override some of the preset options? And the question that I'm being asked is about turning on the sun and where is it getting the sun position. So that's a really good question, because what you may notice is that if this is a sky at sunset, of course these shadows are not really correct. So I made a rendering decision, not a photorealistic rendering decision, because I decided that just some shadows like this to add a little bit more depth and complexity to the rendering was nice. The rendering, even though not correct for where the sun actually is in the sky, is actually a very convincing rendering. So the shadows are being cast when I select sun always by the SketchUp sun position. Does that answer your question? And I'm getting a reply yes. Anyone else have questions about the lighting presets and overriding some of those preset options? Okay, let's move on. By the way, feel free, ask a question anytime you want. Don't wait for me. And when you ask a question, I'll pause and we'll address it. Now, we'll get to some more interesting aspects of IRender Next and lighting. What I'd like to do is add an artificial light to this model. So in order to do that, I'm going to select from the IRender Next menu the Render Ready Components dialog. The picture is of a little chandelier. When I click it, this dialog appears. Render Ready Components are exactly what the title suggests. In the case of lighting, these are light fixtures that include bulbs and default settings for the bulbs that are installed in these lights. So for example, I've selected a classic wall light, really nice little model. The default is that the light intensity for the bulb is 75 watts. The default color is white. When you have the light set up as you want, click Create Place, and then in SketchUp, position the wall lamp wherever you like. And in this case, I've just used this one on the porch. That's it. Once the lamp is in place, you can click Render. We're going to return for just a minute to the settings dialog, because if you remember my last rendering, I turned on the sun. That disabled the HDRi sky preset. Now, when I uncheck sun, now the definition matches again HDRi sky and background, so that's restored just by unchecking the sun. So now let's render the model. So the sun is off. The HDRi sky is being used to illuminate the model from multiple light sources, and my new porch light is turned on. Now, if color and lighting is important, we may decide that we're not entirely satisfied with this porch light being bright white, because if it is an incandescent bulb, white is probably not the right color. So let's select the light, and once we've selected it, this is done by right-clicking. This dialog appears, pop-up menu, the option IRender Next, Override Light Parameters. Click it, and this little dialog appears. I can change the light intensity, so we're going to brighten it to 100%. And I can also modify the color. When I click color, I'm going to use my handy little chart here. Now, this is a chart that I developed that helps me remember, because I do not have these committed to memory at all. But based on the type of bulb in the fixture, I've arrived at some really nice color values that will mimic this type of lighting. My porch light has an incandescent bulb. And so what I've decided is that the appropriate RGB values for an incandescent bulb are bright red, less green, and then far less blue. And I want to mention that this chart, I divided it into two halves. I have warm lighting on this side. Warm lighting simply means that for the most part, the color being used for the light is red. And you can see that. The primary color is red. Warm lighting is both mathematically and artistically warm. On the other side, we have cool lighting. These are lights that are typically falling more into the blue range of the light spectrum. Cool lighting is mathematically cool and artistically neutral. That's why I put neutral in the parentheses. I'd be happy, by the way, to provide anyone who wants it with a copy of this chart. Then what you'll find is that you'll want to probably make adjustments to these RGB values. This is my interpretation of the right colors for these types of lights. There are also a number of very nice resources on the internet that can point you in the right direction. But if you don't want to spend time browsing the internet for a solution, send a question to support@renderplus.com and I will be happy to send you this chart. So I'm going to set my lighting color to match what I believe is appropriate for incandescent lighting. 255, 150, 40, all ready. Click OK. And as you can see, this color is going to be applied to this light when I click OK. So now let's render the model. Again, we're using the lighting preset HDRi Sky. Click Start Rendering. And now we have not only the really nice warm light from our sky, but additionally a much more realistic rendering of an incandescent bulb in this light fixture. Here once again are the two renderings side by side. What's interesting is that because this light is so bright and white, it tends to reduce the warmness of the model from the HDRi Sky. By modifying the color of the light to mimic an incandescent bulb, we restore that nice warm hue on the building. Notice how neutral it is in this one, because the white light just really takes over. It's so bright. But when we change the color to an incandescent bulb, now we're back to a nice warm rendered building. The reflection in the glass in both cases is also quite nice. I think you'll agree that it really helps with the photorealism that we're trying to achieve in this rendering. I pre-placed a couple of other lights, and the way that I got to this menu, by the way, is I clicked this light bulb. Many of you who have used or even are testing IRender Next have probably clicked the light bulb before, and so you may have already been introduced to this really valuable feature in IRender Next called lighting channels. Now, in the last rendering I created, the garden lighting and some recessed lighting, which you'll see in a minute, were both turned off. All that means is that the lighting did not influence the display of the rendering, but all of the lighting was actually calculated by IRender Next. And so when I flip these two on, here's the lighting. Now, because I knew that I was going to use incandescent lighting, when I positioned these lights, I already set the color values for incandescent. And I had a little bit of fun with the garden lights and set them to some nice colors just to make the garden area a little bit more interesting. So now we have an evening rendering of our model at sunset with some very nice and very realistic incandescent lighting on the porch and underneath this overhang. And if you haven't caught on by now, what I'm trying to impress upon you is that IRender Next is going to illuminate the model correctly. So the light is being cast properly. It's being obstructed by surfaces just like you would expect. The next step for me as a designer and a professional renderer is to not necessarily place lights with the default color value set for the bulb, but to use a little bit more license and try to mimic the way these lights actually illuminate in the real world. And in the end, I believe we get a much more convincing, much more realistic rendering from IRender Next with, I hope you'll agree, very little effort. So again, this chart is certainly not complete. I don't have any LED values on here yet, and LED lighting is of course getting more popular all the time for very good reasons. But again, if you'd like a copy of this chart, write down that email address, support@renderplus.com. I would be delighted to send you this chart. If you'd find it helpful to you at all, just ask for it and I'll send it to you. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and move to a different model. This is a very simple little rectangular space. And I wanted to show you this rendering first because it's important for you to understand that in this rendering, there is only one light source. It's this spotlight shining on this wall. Even with one light source, it's interesting that this back wall, the ceiling, the floor, and even the back of this column are actually illuminated. Now this, I admit, is pretty dark, but it's not black. IRender Next is bouncing the lights from surface to surface, illuminating the rest of the model from one light source. We're going to take advantage of this in a number of different ways in this part of our webinar. Now, when this light got positioned, I just put it in place and I didn't change any of the attributes of the lighting at all. That's why it's white. So by now you understand that I'm not going to be satisfied with that. So I changed the light to an incandescent bulb, and here's the result. Let's look at these two side by side. Now you get to decide, which rendering would be more appropriate for your presentation. A nice neutral colored ceiling and wall, or arguably more realistic lighting using an incandescent bulb. Of course, if this were a halogen lamp or an LED lamp, this would probably be the correct lighting. It's amazing, I think, how minor adjustments to the color of the light being cast make such a dramatic difference on the quality of the rendering. So you have a lot of artistic license with IRender Next. either going for as photoreal as you can create or making beautiful renderings to demonstrate your ideas to your clients. I did change this wall to green for the next part, and I did add this ceiling light. Here's my spotlight, and I've right-clicked on this wall hanging because I want to show you that anything in your SketchUp model can behave as a light. So when we right-click, we get this pop-up menu. You'll remember that the option is for IRender Next, and in this case, what I want to do is just edit the material definition for this object. That brings up this dialog. And notice that one of the tabs on this dialog is labeled glow. So what I'd like to do is I'd like for that wall hanging to glow at 40 watts. Now you can click OK to remove the dialog. You might do that if you had more changes or additions to make to your model. Or if that's all that was necessary, the render button is also right here, so you can go from here straight to a rendering. So now I have my incandescent bulb, I have a ceiling lamp, and now this is also illuminating the model. Now this starts to get really interesting, and I think will really help illustrate the importance of color in the lighting solution. This wall hanging is made in a very light blue color. And when I modify the material to add glow, look what happens. Right up here on the ceiling, you'll notice blue highlighting from this glowing object. You'll see the same thing, some blue added to the floor. And look what happens to the brick wall when the blue light hits it, how it just cools the wall down. And then, of course, goes back to the brick's natural color, away from that blue light. I'm kind of stuck on this as an incandescent bulb, so you can see how the incandescent bulb behaves on the ceiling. And then, of course, how incandescent lighting illuminates this green wall. Because lighting is bouncing off of the surfaces, back here in the corner of this room, you'll notice that there is some green tint being added to this wall because the light being reflected off of this wall is mostly green. And then there are some very subtle things happening. For example, this light is causing a little bit of shadow on the column. So the color of this light is not adding to the lighting on the ceiling, nor is the incandescent light from my spotlight. However, green reflected off of the wall is adding a green tint to the shadow on this ceiling. So at first glance, you may not appreciate all of the color in this rendering, but as you study it, you'll discover that there is a considerable amount of color that is being caused by the lighting solution that we've added to this room. Very important to consider as a designer, and very important to pay attention to when you're creating renderings with IRender Next. You get beautiful renderings. I'm going to return to lighting channels. Now, we're going to make some adjustments to this rendering, and the adjustments that we're going to make, imagine that I have created a model, I've added lighting, I love the materials I've selected, The geometry is great. Everything is perfect. The rendering is created. And now what I would like to do for the purposes of my presentation to my client is I want to balance the lighting. So for example, the ceiling light, and admittedly I only have one, but for my presentation rendering, this ceiling light is actually a little bit bright. So the ceiling is on light channel 3, and all I want to do is dim it down. So I went from 0.5, which is half as bright as it could be, down to a 0.1, which is 1/10 of its full brightness value. Those numbers, by the way, aren't important because we're making a decision based on the quality of the rendering. So if we back up, here it is at 0.5. You can see the ceiling and the way that this wall is illuminated. And now lower to 0.1. Once you're satisfied that the light is balanced the way that you want, click OK. And here's the rendering. So I just didn't want the brightness of this ceiling light when there's so many other nice things going on in this space that I want my client to pay attention to. Now sometimes, especially on computer models and with computer renderings, the color can be maybe a little bit overwhelming. So rather than going back to SketchUp and making adjustments to the model, I have a nice little tool in the IRender Next rendering window that we can take advantage of. If you click on this button, this is the Tone and Filters dialog right here. This gives me some very nice features without which I might have to take my rendering out to an imaging program and make the adjustments. But I don't really need to do that because with this dialog, I can do things like adjust the saturation of color. The brightness of the image I'm perfectly happy with. I want to tone down the color just a little. So I'm going to reduce saturation from 100 down to 70. Then I'm going to click Close. Excuse me. And here's my rendering. Now, I think that with the color saturation turned down just a little bit, the brick wall, to me, looks much more real. I think this wood column looks more realistic, and also the flooring. So this is a nice way, after a rendering has been created, to balance lighting, adjust colors, essentially fine-tune the rendering so that it is absolutely perfect for the presentation in front of your client. And now I am going to pause again because I went through a lot of material. If anyone has any questions, please ask away. Or if there's, it doesn't have to be on something that I showed. If you have a question, maybe something about lighting that has you, that is unclear that you'd like clarification on, great time to ask. Okay, so I'm going to back up to lighting channels. I have a question about lighting channels, and let me get back to that slide, and then I'll inform everyone of what the question is. There we go. Okay. The question is about lighting channel number 0, and what does that really mean? Because it shows up on these dialogues frequently, and yet when we come to this menu, we see that lighting channel 0 is labeled Sun. I'm paraphrasing the question. The question is, what does 0 mean? And then why, when we get here, is it set to Sun? Lighting channel 0 is exclusively reserved for the SketchUp Sun position. So I am not adding lights. I'm unable to add more lights to channel 0. When a light is added to a model, and now I'm going to, if you'll bear with me, I'm going to go back to another slide where we added a light. By default, when we add lights, lighting channel would be set to 0. You can see right here, 0 for default. And again, with all due respect to the question, I appreciate that this can be a little bit confusing because we know 0 is the sun, then how can 0 also be the default? And the answer is a lot simpler than you might think. When we add a light to the model, if the lighting channel is set to 0, IRender Next will assign a lighting channel for the fixture automatically. There are lighting channels that IRender Next anticipates, and those include glow, ceiling, and some others. So it's not necessary for us to specifically address lighting channels every time we place a light fixture. Most of the time, just let IRender Next manage that for you. However, there are times when you may have a specific purpose with a light, and an example would be when I added the porch light. You can see that I actually assigned the porch light to channel 3. What that permitted is that I can then flip the porch light on and off by itself. Most of the time, that may not be that important, but in some renderings, that might be a very nice option for you. Okay, so 0, when you're adding a light, means let IRender Next select the appropriate channel for you. 0 with regard to manipulating lighting channels means the sun and whether or not the sun is on or off for the rendering. I'm hoping that if nothing else, it's a little less confusing now. And I'm getting an answer that yes, now this makes sense. Okay, good. I do appreciate that it's a little bit confusing, especially if you're not, if you don't have a whole lot of experience with IRender Next. Any other questions with regard to lighting and color and rendering and lighting presets with IRender Next? Okay, and I have a question about lighting presets. So I'm going to go back to one of our first images. And the question is it necessary to select a lighting preset? And the answer is when you start IRender Next and you open a model or you work on a model, by default, when this menu displays, there will be a preset selected. Could you explain overall luminance and lock luminance? I can. In fact, let me finish this answer, and then I'm going to go right back to that menu and tell you what that's all about. Okay, so there's always a preset selected, and by either ignoring this entirely and then addressing lighting channels specifically, you can set up lighting appropriate for the type of rendering that you intend to create. However, a lot of times the best first start is select a preset and then modify from that preset to get the lighting that you want. By turning, for example, if I select interior, this is going to be a silly example, but bear with me. If I turn on interior with sun, and then as it turns out I really don't want the sun, so I go to the settings dialog and I turn the sun channel off, and I say it's silly because obviously that's the same as interior with no sun. And when you came back to this dialog, you would actually see interior with no sun enabled. Lighting presets are a very efficient way for novice IRender NXT users and experts to quickly establish some rules for lighting and then adjust them appropriately in order to create the final renderings. Now let's go back to the lighting channels dialog. And let's talk about lock luminance. I appreciate the question because it took me a while to catch on to this myself. When lock luminance is checked, that means that altering the values of individual lighting channels will permit the rendering overall to brighten or darken. If lock luminance is unchecked, what that means is the overall brightness of the rendering is going to be unchangeable. And I have to tell you, I don't even have a good example of why I would want this unchecked. Because if you uncheck this and then were to, for example, turn off this ceiling light, well, this ceiling light, as it turns out, is actually by itself adding quite a lot of luminous of lighting to this rendering. So when I lowered the value, the other lighting, it would appear that the other lighting starts to make up for it to keep the overall brightness of this room the same. And there may be lots of reasons why that's a great idea. In the renderings that I do, I actually don't want that happening. And in fact, when I've kind of forgotten about this and maybe left it unchecked, I've gotten some real surprises when I've altered lighting values. It's not that what the software is doing is incorrect. The software is doing the right thing. It just gets me towards lighting in a room that I am not really after. So I tend to leave this checked. Wow. If that was even close to giving you a good explanation, let me know. And if I need to try again, I'm happy to do so. Yes, that helps. That's a really cordial answer. It helps, but it's probably not crystal clear. Here's what you'll experience. Check lock luminance and then put a light on its own channel and then adjust the values. And what you'll notice is that turning up or down the value of that light is going to affect the overall lighting in the room exactly the way that you would expect it to. And in fact, when you turn off that light, the effect on the room will be exactly what you expect. And then just for fun, uncheck this and then go through the same thing. And you'll see results that will not necessarily even make sense to you because all of a sudden it's not behaving as though that light is doing what it should do, because the overall luminance of the room is going to be retained even when you adjust up or down light fixtures. Anyone else have a question on anything that we've covered, or just any IRender NXT question at all would actually be perfectly fine. We'll do our best. You know, at Render Plus, we hope these webinars are helpful, and we want to focus on specific topics because we know that lighting, for example, can seem like kind of a complicated topic, and hopefully what you've discovered today is, in actual fact, it's a lot more straightforward than you might have imagined. Lights are thrown in a specific direction in the case of a point light. They are omnidirectional in the case of this glow light, and actually omnidirectional in the case of this light. The only difference is that this light is up in a can. It's actually an incandescent bulb stuck up in a can, and so that can itself is sort of restricting the way the light is illuminating the space. Setting lighting colors, I hope you've discovered today, is a very important part of creating renderings that look real. And I want to remind you again, if anybody who wants that chart, just ask. Send a question to support at Render Plus Systems, and I'll get that out to you immediately. If there are no other questions, I appreciate everyone joining us this afternoon. If questions come up later, please feel free to send them to support. Let me know that you were at the webinar and that I said something that really confused you, and I'll do my best to clarify. Also, this webinar will be published as a video on our YouTube channel, and that'll probably happen sometime later this afternoon. Early next week, you will receive an email from Render Plus Systems, and I want to encourage you, open up that email, because we have some very interesting information for you as a follow-up to this webinar. You'll find it helpful. And certainly for the next couple weeks, if you see an email from us, trust us that it's something that we want to share with you that we think you'll find very helpful. And our goal in all of this is to help you to become expert users with IRender Next. What we're hoping is that as you develop your skills with this software, you're going to become the best computer renderers in the business. And we're here to help you do that. So ask questions, send questions to support@renderplus.com. Visit our YouTube channel and visit our website whenever you need help. We're here to help you, and hopefully today was a good start in that direction. So thanks again, everybody. Check on renderplus.com for our webinar schedule. We're adding new webinars all the time. We're adding new topics. And again, the goal is very straightforward. We want to help you become experts in photorealistic rendering of your SketchUp models. With that, I have some renderings to do. I'm sure you all do too. So let's go have some fun.